It's a major Russian invasion of Ukraine with the beginning of hostilities and an all-out offensive on land, from sea and especially from air. Kiev, Ukraine's capital, claims that a full-blown airborne assault has been carried out today. This after Vladimir Putin, in an emergency statement, announced that Russia will carry out special military action aimed at demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine.
Ukrainians woke to a war on their country. At 4:30 a.m., the first of 7 rockets struck a military base on Kiev's outskirts. Soon, Kharkiv, Lugansk, Mariupol and Donbass all came under attack. Around the same time, Russian tanks and armored vehicles rolled into Ukraine from occupied Crimea. The invasion had started. Ukraine and the world's worst fears had come true.
We simply don't have any other choice to protect our people, and we'll have to use the only available choice that we will use today. I've taken the decision to conduct a special military operation. Its purpose is to protect people who have been subject to abuse and genocide by the Kiev regime for 8 years. And to do this, we will strive to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine.
The Ukrainian retaliation was swift. Kiev claimed it had downed 6 Russian planes, even as Moscow said it destroyed air bases. At ground zero, India today captured the fear and panic in Ukraine.
Images on your television screen now tell you more about the military movement that's taking place towards the battle zone. Now, this is where one convoy after the other. We are on the high street here in Mariupol, and military convoy, one after the other, heading towards the front lines.
So I will also walk a bit and show you the situation near the city, Kyiv City Council. The protection of the building has also been strengthened. You can see the military standing outside the building. And one more thing, so you can see that they are changing the location of their post. Sorry for such strange reporting, but everything is changing every minute.
In eastern Ukraine, fighting raged. Ukraine claimed it had killed at least 50 Russian soldiers. Russia said several Ukrainian villages were under its control. As missiles rained, Ukraine closed the country's airspace. Kyiv International Airport was evacuated and shut down. The capital and other cities began seeing shortage of food and fuel as panic buying started. The Russian President Putin's invasion has been called a barbaric act by world leaders. But with weeks of diplomacy falling flat, it is an uncertain future ahead for Ukrainians. Bureau Report, India Today.
And here on India Today, after what has been 12 hours of open combat, conflict, missile strikes, bombings, firing by artillery, laser-guided bombs, air power attacks, claims and counterclaims on both sides, and a great deal of uncertainty that stretches before Ukraine and the region at large. Because we've shown you that the impact here is not just on Ukraine, where it is most immediate and the suffering is most immediate, but the uncertainty for the world at large stretches into the horizon. And that's why, to give you some of the finest perspective on a world at war, we're privileged to be joined on this high-level roundtable on India Today by Dakota Wood. He's a senior research fellow for defense programs at the prestigious Heritage Foundation. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. Lieutenant General Syed Atta Hasnain. He's a veteran of the Indian Army, former General Officer commanding of the 15th Corps, of one of India's most respected strategic affairs analysts and observers. We also have with us Vishnu Prakash, former diplomat and very well-regarded foreign affairs expert. He's been ambassador to several countries. Nandan Unikrishnan, well-known strategic observer, distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, and Tatiana Kukhareva is a journalist in Moscow. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for your time. On a day when, when the images have really befuddled, stupefied people. There was a sense that maybe things wouldn't actually reach this stage, but here we are, and now all of our viewers await your perspective on where things are at. I'd like to start with Tatiana. She's a journalist in Moscow. Tatiana, the images of an airborne heli assault on an airbase just north of Kiev appears to suggest, these are images that have been put out by Ukraine. They haven't been officially denied by Russia. Appears to suggest that this is an invasion. Russian heli-borne forces, taking over an airbase near Kiev.
Well, so far, as you rightly mentioned, the Russian side has not confirmed any such reports. The Ministry of Defense has just put out a report about the gains within this operation. We're calling it a military operation that has been, rightly so, targeting military sites within Ukraine, so airfields, air defense systems, and such. And unfortunately, until there is such confirmation, those would be some one-sided reports. And unfortunately, we would be unable to completely verify their authenticity.
Okay, you're saying you're unable to verify the authenticity. Earlier, the Russians had said that there is no invasion as such, but this has become, in many ways, the image that we have on our screen of those helicopters flying into Ukrainian airspace just north of Kiev have become a face of the operation, as also the damage that has been caused on the ground. Mr. Wood, to bring you in on this, we're also going to be joined in just a moment by a senior journalist from Kiev. But Mr. Wood, many things have happened in the last 12 hours that has changed the game dramatically. We've heard President Putin speak. We've heard the US president speak as well. There are great expectations from Ukraine at this point of time. We haven't heard of anything more than sanctions being applied, by the NATO countries and the United States. Do you see that changing now, sir?
I think that current situations could dramatically change that. The drumbeat has been that Western military forces, United States, Germany, others, would not enter Ukraine to do battle with Russia. I think the countries involved will probably try to maintain that line, and we're going to see today a raft of very severe sanctions. They must focus on Russia's sale of minerals and energy, oil, to really make important the economic pain or the cost of this invasion of Ukraine. So, the United States, Germany, and Britain and others will hold off on committing military forces, but it may very well come down to that. I have colleagues in Germany and elsewhere who say that an amphibious landing has occurred to seize the port city of Odessa and Mariupol. They're on the Sea of Azov. So this is a profoundly important moment in modern history. And if Europe does not bind together and support Ukraine with military supplies and ammunition and targeting information and intelligence, then we will rue the day that Russia will be a dominant player in European matters for years to come.
General Hasnain, your perspective on how things have changed in the last 12 hours, and more importantly, your assessment, sir, of what you see happen next. I know that it's the million-dollar question that everyone's asking, but do you see NATO being drawn in? Do you see any other non-sanction action by the United States? Because that's what everyone's wondering now.
Shiv, thank you for having me on this program with you. A very, very interesting moment. I admit I went wrong. My assessment was that it would be brinkmanship till the end, and President Putin would not press the final button. I think I got proved wrong. Now, why do I feel that I was wrong completely? You see, the situation has dramatically changed, there's no doubt. Let me give you a slight historical perspective. 1956, the Soviet Union entered into Hungary. well, it was part of Warsaw Pact, nothing happened. 1968, they entered into Czechoslovakia with a huge number of tanks and ground forces, nothing happened. It was still a part of Warsaw Pact. Today, Ukraine, looking at joining NATO, is not a part of Warsaw Pact, is not a part of any Russian compact at all. So it's a strange thing that in today's situation, NATO, European Union, the United States, no one is wishing to respond in any military way at all. Now, this is almost similar to what it was during the Cold War, if you remember.
Yeah.
At that time also, deterrence was primarily not through ground forces, etc. It was primarily through nuclear weapons. Now, that is the thing today. Are we still looking at deterrence through nuclear weapons? Definitely not. So today, you are finding that sanctions, and the expected that intense sanctioning will probably achieve its diplomatic objectives. To my mind, I think the United States and NATO is wrong as far as this is concerned, because the world is changing. You'll find a Russia-China compact probably emerging, although China itself is also playing very, very carefully on Ukraine. So there will be something else which will play out. The Russians have obviously done their homework, it seems, although I don't support this at all. It's going to lead to casualties and all kinds of things. The Russians have calculated that. They're putting out a tremendous amount of information into the information space, hoping like hell that the Ukrainians will capitulate and not fight finally. The aim is regime change. This is what they want. Can they achieve it in the next 3, 4, 5 days? Or are the Ukrainians likely to push back? This in the next 3, 4 days are very crucial. What's happening at the moment is only shaping the battlefield. Nothing else. Air power, missile strikes, cyber war, an amphibious landing in Odessa, a strike in the Sea of Azov. This is all shaping the battlefield. The actual contact battle hasn't started yet. And only when the contact battle starts will we start getting the real picture of who is where in this whole situation.
Interesting. So you're saying that all these attacks we're seeing right now is just softening things up. The actual contact battle and the actual, intention is something else entirely. Ambassador Prakash, do you think there's going to be any pushback? We've heard Ukraine, plead with the West and NATO for, more weaponry, more help, on the ground. Do you see that? Do you see that changing at all, sir?
Good evening, Shiv. I do not see that changing. In addition to supplying weapons and extending support, Boris Johnson has also offered prayers. So that is what Ukraine is going to get. It's today's address in the morning by President Putin. It is before I refer to that, let me say that what has been done is aggression. You cannot call it anything else. But President Putin was very bitter, was very angry. And when he says that the West has played us, they have deceived us, and they have been disdainful of our security. That I think goes to the heart of the matter. What President Putin is doing now is, in my view, is taking double insurance. One is to create a buffer zone between Ukraine and Russia. And second is to bring about a regime that will not be anti-Russia. And third is to degrade the defenses and the security or the defense establishment, defense assets of Ukraine. Last point that I would like to make is that the seeds, it should never have come to such a pass. But the seeds of this situation was sown in the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008, when Bush and Condi Rice had literally arm twisted the European countries into opening up the doors for Ukraine, the NATO doors. At that time, Russia was weak. USA was the sole pole, was at a polar position. Today, things have changed. Russia is stronger. And the US has just had a massive setback in Afghanistan. So this was the time, and Putin has struck.
Putin is struck here, and he's struck, at a time. There is, of course, one perception that, Putin had played a very smart game so far by, managing to do what he wanted to do, creating this buffer zone, without actually firing a shot. But has he made a strategic mistake now by actually sending his troops in and imposing air power? That remains to be seen, and that can only be perhaps assessed by whatever reaction comes in from NATO and the West. Mr. Unnikrishnan, what is your view on where this is going? I don't mean to ask a broad question, but there are so many variables on this chessboard right now. What path do you think is going to, this situation is going to take? Because right now, it's combat, it's attacks, it's missiles landing in Ukraine, sir.
Well, yes, thank you, Chef, for inviting me. I think Ambassador Prakash and General Hasnain have summarized the situation reasonably well. I would only say that we need to know what is the end game. Is the end game regime change? Is the end game merely expanding the areas under control of the rebel republics? Or is it to establish a land bridge to Crimea?
Yeah.
We don't know. So I agree with General Hasnain that right now what we are seeing are actions that are actually shaping the battle of the future, which will probably become clearer over the next 3-4 days. I personally feel that Ambassador Prakash spoke about Russia feeling aggrieved and deceived. I think the deceived party, and I really feel sorry for them, the deceived party here is Ukraine. Ukraine was misled into believing that it actually stood a chance of joining NATO, that its friends would come to its defense. And today, unfortunately, after being led up the garden path, they were pushed off from the cliff at the end of that path. And they will have to resist bravely. I mean, no intervention of this kind can be condoned. But given the overwhelming superiority of Russian conventional forces,
yes,
I really don't know how this is going to play out for Ukraine. But time will show.
That's an ominous assessment that Ukraine has been deceived. It's been led up the garden path as far as whether it can enter NATO and whether NATO would come to its aid is concerned. Mr. Wood, would you like to add to that? The perception that Ukraine has been deceived and sort of left out to dry.
Well, I do largely agree with that. The whole deal back in, 1994, was that if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, then it wouldn't really have to be concerned for the larger security that nuclear weapons would provide, because the West gave assurances. I mean, there wasn't a signed treaty or anything, an obligation in a legal sense, but there were these assurances that were made. So they give up these weapons. Everybody's going along in the happy 1990s. And then the rest of the world gets distracted with things, counterterrorism in the wake of 9/11 there in 2001 and all. And Russia has found its feet, right, with modernizing its forces, shrinking its military to make it much more professional, and it's fully modernized now. So I think we need to pay attention to what Vladimir Putin has actually said. And then a couple of days ago, he gave this kind of rambling account of Russian history, and he envisions not a return to the Soviet Union, but to Tsarist Russia, the Russian Empire of the 19th century that stretched from Central Asia all the way westward to cover half of Europe. So I think this is an opening gambit to that. They do have demographic problems. They have industrial problems in their economy. And so there is a window that presents. Now, the strategic mistake that he has made is that with this move, it will wake up Germany and France and Italy and Great Britain and Poland and other countries, and they will have to seriously reconsider their own defense postures, increase defense spending, modernize their military forces as a response to this naked Russian aggression. The same thing is occurring in the Pacific as China becomes more militarized and expanding out, and you see the doubling of the Japanese defense budget. So these sorts of military moves generate a response. Unfortunately, it's too late for Ukraine. Russia has 10 times the military power in many areas than Ukraine does. So it's going to be kind of a losing battle, I think, for the Ukrainians. And it'll be a very difficult security situation for Russia to manage over any period of time. That is certainly a message to the rest of Europe. And it's a message to the United States and other countries that really want peace and prosperity, free trade, the rule of law, representative democracies. You know, India is such a great example of that, right? So this is a message to the rest of the world that we need to get serious about the realities of global affairs and that conventional military power still means something. You know, this isn't artificial intelligence or cyber or directed energy or unmanned stuff. I mean, these are tank columns and artillery and missiles and
very
those
conventional
sorts of things.
force.
And we tended to forget that.
Absolutely. Tatiana, and to add to what Mr. Wood said, as Mr. Unnikrishnan had said, in the absence of any of these countries stepping forward to come to Ukraine's aid, it's perhaps too late as well. Ukraine will have to fight back bravely with whatever it has at this time. It's a bit of a pathetic situation on the ground there. But as Ukraine comes to terms, with the reality of this evolving situation, Tatiana, to come to a couple of the things that Ambassador Prakash mentioned, which is the end game for Russia and President Putin, the buffer zone. There are many who believe that the declaration of independence of those two, eastern states, could have been an end game in itself as far as the buffer zone is concerned. Many are wondering now that bullets have been fired, now that missiles are in the air, what is the end game? How much further can this military conflict be escalated for President Putin to reach the targets that he wants to, which is that buffer zone for possibly regime change in Ukraine, and as he called it, the denazification, that's the word he used, of Ukraine?
He did use that word, and I think that this is a very important point here as well. Look, as for the end game, if we're taking into account what has been said by the president, and he's reiterated multiple times, unfortunately, our Western colleagues are not listening, that nobody's looking to occupy Ukraine. It's not in Russia's interests, and it's definitely not on the agenda for President Putin. However, we do need to understand that if we throw back a little bit, it's something that Mr. Wood said. He said that there needs to be a consolidation. The European countries have to come to the rescue and to unite, around Ukraine. But they have united, didn't they? They did unite back in 2014, especially, the US, the almost $3 billion in military aid that has been supplied to Ukraine over this period of time. And somehow everybody forgets that those 8 years were 8 years of civil war, 8 years of killing people, 13,000 civilian victims in the Donbass region. And the Western states didn't act once. They didn't once put enough pressure on Kiev to stop those hostilities. We had a diplomatic solution in place. There were the Minsk agreements. Not one point of those agreements was ever observed by Kiev. And somehow, after 8 years of this never-ending violence of people in the border regions, even on the Russian side, living in constant fear of shelling by Ukrainian forces, somehow it's still perceived as an uncalled for move by our Western colleagues. If you look at the numbers, just, what was it, last month, the lethal US aid, the 200,000 pounds of lethal aid that the US supplied to Ukraine. I mean, we're talking about what you're calling Russian aggression. In the meantime, if you look at it from the perspective of the people who live across the border and they see that amount of military aid being amassed, and we're not even talking about the Baltic states, where NATO has been gradually increasing their presence. increasing despite demands, despite, asking politely, despite requests from Moscow to respect the red lines that the president spoke for endless times. On endless occasions, he said that the red lines must not be crossed. And yet we still have NATO expanding, NATO posing an actual threat on our doorstep.
Right.
I do believe, Mr. Wood, you would not argue with me that if, for instance, Russian forces were amassing across the border from the US, if we put missiles in there and rocket launchers and send in $3 billion worth of lethal aid, it would bother the Washington, D.C., wouldn't it?
Mr. Wood, quick response from you, then I'll get the others in.
Well, I think it's a fantasy notion that any NATO country posed any sort of military threat to Russia. I mean, that has never been suggested that any, like Estonia, attacking across the border into, Russia or something like that. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense. This has been aggression by Russia from the very beginning. They've been fomenting and supporting these separatist rebels in the eastern part of Ukraine, and it has only been a Ukrainian response to try to regain control of that. So Russian military has been on the ground. They've been providing these separatists in the Donbass region with lethal support. And so these are merely responses to something that was fomented by Russia so that Vladimir Putin could reclaim territory that he believes was unfairly lost with the collapse of the Soviet Union. He has said that the collapse of the USSR was the greatest geostrategic catastrophe of the 20th century, right? So here you have a lot of former Soviet republics that wanted representative democracies. They wanted to be part of the European Union for all the economic benefits from that. And it really rubs Vladimir Putin wrong. And he wants to reclaim them. And he's doing this by military force. It's indisputable.
Again, look, coming back to what you started with, you're saying NATO countries do not pose a threat. Then why amass that military personnel? Why send more systems, more military personnel, more armory to Poland, to the Baltic states? What is the threat coming from Russia, which has stayed within the same borders this whole time?
Russia has consistently violated the airspace and the sea space of the Nordic countries and of the Baltic states.
I just want to, after Mr. Wood finishes his answer, I'd like to bring the others in. I don't want to restrict it to only you two. Yeah, quickly finish your answer, Mr. Wood.
No, I'm just saying, the history is plain in terms of what Russian air and ground forces and naval forces have done to violate the territorial and economic spaces of the Nordic countries, the Baltic states, and what they have done in other parts of Europe.
Ambassador Prakash, you wanted to come in on the points made by Dakota and Tatiana. Go ahead.
Yes, my short point is that if Russia was not to be contained, if Russia was not perceived as a threat, what was the rationale for constant enlargement of NATO and taking it virtually to the doorsteps of Russia? Was it to prepare for Chinese threat? I mean, there is a lot of posturing that is going on all sides. But the reality is, I'm not advocating, I don't hold a brief for Russia. But security, as Chancellor Scholz said last week when he had come to Moscow, he said something profound. And he said that the European security is enhanced if Russian security is enhanced, not against Russia, but with Russia. Now, had that been the mantra, then it would never have come to a pass. But the reality is that Russian security, the legitimate security interests, I'm saying legitimate, I have also said that what has happened is aggression, but the legitimate security interests were ignored. Now the ramifications are going to be huge. There is a country called China, which has designs not over just Asia, but the world. They will be watching very carefully and they would be drawing conclusions which is not in the best interest of peace and stability in the world.
General Hasnain, taking off from what Ambassador Prakash has said and the others have said, I want to try and narrow it down just a little bit. Because, before the events of today, we've seen NATO, we've seen the White House we've seen the Kremlin all talk about, a peaceful resolution to this problem, which is kind of funny given the events of the last 12 hours. But I'm still wondering, and this is not a rhetorical question, I'm still wondering, is there a diplomatic way out now? I'm wondering because how much further can this current situation escalate militarily?
Shiv, that's a very good question, there's no doubt. But let me start by saying this has been a huge miscalculation by NATO, by the European nations, pushing Russia into the situation that it is. I again don't have any brief for Russia, but all this which has been spoken, getting to the Baltic states, reinforcing the Baltic states' militaries and things like that, this has all been a huge miscalculation. There has to be a limit to the security of a nation. Well, the pushback against Russia should have been in such a way that some space should have been allowed to Russia. It is almost like the Treaty of Versailles, 1919. 20 years later, German nationalism showed the world what it was all about. So this is something very similar, which is happening here. But to come back to your main question, it is still premature to say what is Russia's aim. You see, in any kind of a war, any kind of a military operation, if you're entering into conventional operations particularly, you have to have your political and military aims. Now, so far we are assessing regime change and things like that. Perhaps President Putin only wants to do a big demonstration. He wants to demonstrate that enough is enough, I will push you back, I will use military power if necessary. Don't unnecessarily needle me. Now, this is the kind of message which can very well be there. And next 5 days, you may find a lot of military activity taking place, and then potentially some back channels opening up, and you may find this whole thing winding down. That is only a 10-15% chance which I'm looking at the moment. Otherwise, I think President Putin is on pig's back at the moment.
Okay, so it's advantage Putin at this point of time. Mr. Unikrishnan, there is a sense, some believe, I wonder if you agree, that the NATO and the West have been caught having, not conducted a crucial wargaming of this entire situation. They, like you said, Ukraine had been led up the garden path, but the West also, perhaps miscalculated in a big way, as General Hasnain mentioned. Has there been any miscalculation by President Putin in your view, sir? Because now that he's got his boots in, he's got his helicopters in, do you think he would have sort of wargamed how this plays out, what happens next?
I think President Putin would have obviously calculated a variety of scenarios, but President Putin is not superhuman, neither are his advisors. There are surely a variety of scenarios they could not even conceive of that still exist and could play out. The point here is, however, not about these calculations. The point here is that I firstly agree with General Hasnain that there was a miscalculation maybe on the side of NATO. But if I look at the outcomes that have happened today as a result of this invasion or this action by the Russians, I'm a bit of a cynic. So I think both the United States and Russia should be happy with the outcomes. Russia has achieved a buffer zone. There is no hope that Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus are going to be part of NATO for the next 30, 40 years at least, right? So that is one. And that is what the Russians were seeking. The United States has unified Germany behind its leadership. All dissent in Europe has been put away. And Biden has come out as a strong leader of the Western world. That was the whole purpose of the exercise in the first place. So now if both sides are rational, they should cease and desist, if you want, and allow Mr. Biden should now shift his focus to his domestic matters as well as the Indo-Pacific, which would be good for us. And Mr. Putin should get back to the barracks and try and win back the hearts of the Ukrainians.
Is that, Tatiana, do you want to respond to that? Is that something you see playing out?
You mean the retreat?
Yeah, yeah. And winning the hearts of the Ukrainians and going back to the barracks.
Going back to the barracks. Well, look, I think that so far, well, we'll obviously have to wait and see, but so far this has been a very clear message. The message to NATO countries, and obviously to Kiev, because they were essentially the ones ignoring all requests from Russia to stop the civilian deaths. And I think that once the military forces will achieve whatever they set out to achieve, and we've all heard everything that's been stated by the Russian Defense Ministry, I think this is the time where there will be another clear message from Moscow, maybe even as soon as this evening. Because look, this is the point that has been made throughout these last 24 hours. We're not looking for violence. We're not looking for civilian casualties. We're not looking for war.
Yeah.
Moscow has not set out its intentions as in, occupying a country or forcing a regime change or anything. We want a stop to war.
Okay. We're just getting in some news that we'll be breaking in just... Okay, we're just getting some news. Okay, we've got some breaking news that I want to bring to all of our panelists right now. Prime Minister Modi likely to speak to President Putin in a short while from now. We're getting information from top government sources that the Prime Minister is likely to have a phone chat with President Putin in just a short while from now. Ambassador Prakash, I want you to weigh in on this. We heard the Ukrainian ambassador earlier today put out a message. He held a press conference practically pleading with the Indian government, the Indian Prime Minister, to get on the phone with Putin saying, you've got influence, speak to him, call him off, try and reason with him, make him see sense. Those are the kinds of words that were actually used. It was an emotional time, of course. But what would this conversation be about? The Indian government has also held a high-level, almost a cabinet committee on security level meeting on the Ukraine crisis. What would this phone call be about, sir? What would it contain?
What the Ukrainian ambassador said is something that has come to light. What we do not know, perhaps, is that some world leaders would have weighed in with Prime Minister Modi, and which we'll get to know by and by. Prime Minister Modi and President Putin have a very good equation.
Yes.
And India is not prescriptive. India is not in the business of threatening countries. So I think India's Prime Minister Modi, when he speaks to President Putin, would perhaps give his point of view. And that is something that has been articulated, in my view, at the UN Security Council also, because the solution to this issue is the good old diplomatic talks, is strategic accommodation, it is negotiations, it is give and take. War and conflict is not the solution. But the challenge, Shiv, as I see it, and I hope I'm wrong, is that President Putin had waited all this while, hoping that the core concern would be recognized, even if they are not given official guarantees or written guarantees that Ukraine will not be a part of NATO. At least that will be understood. But now that was not forthcoming, he has pressed the button. And he has taken a huge risk because, it is now that he has pressed the button, he has gone in, he will complete, in my view, what he has set out to do. I agree with General Hasnan, what he was saying, but now that he has started it, why will he leave it unfinished? I mean, he would make sure that there is, in the foreseeable future, a regime does not happen in Ukraine, which is unfriendly to Moscow. And I don't think that he has any interest in occupying Ukraine, because that is going to haunt him. It would become another Afghanistan. But to have a pro-Russia regime is something that he would want to do. I also am a little perplexed. Last point that I would like to make is the categorical statement by President Biden yesterday when he said that we will defend every inch of quote-unquote NATO territory. I mean, that was very clear to President Putin that the Western world will not put boots on the ground. And was that kind of a categorical statement and also a statement to say that we have no intention of fighting Russia?
Okay.
What it meant, I mean, it is a little perplexing, but now that we have this situation, I think the room for diplomacy has receded for the time being till the strategic objectives of President Putin are achieved.
Okay, and in light of that, of the fact that the possibility of diplomacy has receded until strategic objectives of Russia have been achieved, Mr. Unnikrishnan, to bring you in on this, once again, in the context of any potential diplomatic or other role that India can play in this entire situation, as the Ukrainian ambassador has wanted, with the Prime Minister about to phone President Putin, what would you think that conversation would go like?
I wish I had such insights into the minds of Mr. Modi and Mr. Putin. Both of those are black holes which are far more sophisticated than my simple mind. I would imagine that Mr. Modi would suggest to Mr. Putin that a diplomatic path to the solution of the Ukrainian problem is still something that he should look for and should be the preferable path to resolution. I think Mr. Modi would suggest that it is still possible to go down that path. And he would also want to try and understand from Mr. Putin what were the objectives of this entire move? What is it that eventually triggered Mr. Putin's actions? I completely agree with Tatiana that, the fact that for 8 years, repeated conversations over Minsk, its implementation did not bring any results, could frustrate any of the parties involved. And the internal situation developing in Ukraine was such that I think President Putin decided that the Minsk talks, the Minsk process was as good as dead. So hopefully the conversation between Mr. Modi and Mr. Putin would help both of them understand what the other one is up to.
We're going to have to see what happens in that conversation. Like Nandan Unnikrishnan said, two black holes. So we may never know what happens in that conversation. We can only end up conjecturing. Maybe some information will come out about that chat as well. This is a big global crisis that we're looking at. Like I said, it's not just about the missiles landing there. The impact is being felt at every possible level. The stock exchanges, economy, trade, the price of oil, crypto even has fallen 20%. So everywhere you look, there is a ripple effect, there are shockwaves, and there is impact. Tatiana, Mr. Unnikrishnan, Dakota Wood, Ambassador Prakash, General Hasnain, always a pleasure and a privilege. We know more about this listening to all of you. So thank you very much for giving us your time this evening here on India Today. I'm leaving my viewers only for 30 seconds with these defining images of that heli-borne assault on a suburb of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. On the other side of the short break, for a full hour uninterrupted, I'm going to play for you all the most dramatic, defining images of what has been a country at war today. India Today, the most watched channel. Stay with me right after this.